Triss Merigold blew into her frozen hands, wriggled her fingers, and murmured a magic formula. Her horse, a gelding, immediately reacted to the spell, snorting and turning its head, looking at the enchantress with eyes made watery by the cold and wind. "You've got two options, old thing," said Triss, pulling on her gloves. "Either you get used to magic, or I sell you to some peasants to pull a plough." The gelding pricked up its ears, snorted vapour through its nostrils, and obediently started down the wooded mountainside. The magician leaned over in the saddle, avoiding being lashed by the frosty branches. The magic worked quickly. She stopped feeling the sting of cold in her elbows and on her neck, and the unpleasant sensation of cold, which had made her hunch her shoulders and draw her head in, disappeared. The spell, warming her, also muffled the hunger which had been eating at her for several hours. Triss cheered up, made herself comfortable in the saddle, and, with greater attention than before, started to take stock of her surroundings. Ever since she had left the beaten track, she had been guided by the greyish-white wall of mountains and their snow-capped summits, which glistened gold in those rare moments when the sun pierced the clouds, usually in the morning or just before sunset. Now that she was closer to the mountain chain, she had to take greater care. The land around Kaer Morhen was famous for its wildness and inaccessibility, and the gap in the granite wall that was a vital landmark was not easy for an inexperienced eye to find. It was enough to turn down one of the numerous gullies and gorges to lose sight of it, and even she, who knew the land, knew the way, and knew where to look for the pass, could not allow herself to lose her concentration for an instant. The forest came to an end. A wide valley opened before the enchantress, strewn with boulders which ran across the valley to the sheer mountain slope on the other side. The Gwenllech, the river of white stones, flowed down the heart of the valley, foam seething between the boulders and logs washed along by the current. Here in its upper reaches, the Gwenllech was no more than a wide but shallow stream. Up here it could be crossed without any difficulty. Lower down in Caedwen, in its middle reaches, the river was an insurmountable obstacle, rushing and breaking against the beds of its steep chasms. The gelding, driven into the water, hastened its step, clearly wanting to reach the opposite bank as quickly as possible. Triss held it back lightly. The stream was shallow, reaching just above the horse's fetlocks, but the pebbles covering the bed were slippery, and the current was sharp and quick. The water churned and foamed around her mount's legs. The magician looked up at the sky. The growing cold and increasing wind here in the mountains could herald a blizzard, and she did not find the prospect of spending yet another night in a grotto or rocky nook too attractive. She could, if she had to, continue her journey even through a blizzard. She could locate the path using telepathy. She could, using magic, make herself insensitive to the cold. She could, if she had to. But she preferred not to have to. Luckily, Kaer Morhen was already close. Triss urged the gelding onto flat scree, over an enormous heap of stones washed down by glaciers and streams, and rode into a narrow pass between rocky outcrops. The gorge walls rose vertically and seemed to meet high above her, only divided by a narrow line of sky. It grew warmer. The wind, howling above the rocks, could no longer reach to lash and sting at her. The pass broadened, leading through a ravine and then into the valley, opening onto a huge depression covered by forest, which stretched out amidst jagged boulders. The magician ignored the gentle, accessible depression rim and rode down towards the forest, into the thick backwoods. Dry branches cracked under the gelding's hooves. Forced to step over fallen tree trunks, the horse snorted, danced, and stamped. Triss pulled at the reins, tugged at her mount's shaggy ear, and scolded it harshly with spiteful allusions to its lameness. The steed, looking for all the world as though it were ashamed of itself, walked with a more even and sprightly gait, and picked its way through the thicket. Before long, they emerged onto clearer land, riding along the trough of the stream, which barely trickled along the ravine bed. The magician looked around carefully, finally finding what she was looking for. Over the gully, supported horizontally by enormous boulders, lay a mighty tree trunk, dark, bare, and turning green with moss. Triss rode closer, wanting to make sure this was, indeed, the trail, and not a tree accidentally felled in a gale. But she spied a narrow, indistinct pathway disappearing into the woods. She could not be mistaken. This was definitely the trail. a path encircling the old castle of Kaer Morhen and beset with obstacles where witches trained to improve their running speeds and controlled breathing. The path was known as the Trail, but Triss knew young witches had given it their own name, the Killer. She clung to the horse's neck and slowly rode under the trunk. At that moment, she heard stones grating and the fast, light footsteps of someone running. She turned in her saddle, pulled on the reins, and waited for the Witcher to run out onto the log. A Witcher did run out onto the log, flitted along it like an arrow without slowing down, without even using his arms to aid his balance, running nimbly, fluently, with incredible grace. He flashed by, approaching and disappearing amongst the trees without disturbing a single branch. Triss sighed loudly, shaking her head in disbelief, because the Witcher, judging by his height and build, was only about 12. The magician eased the reins, nudged the horse with her heels, and trotted upstream. She knew the trail cut across the ravine once more at a spot known as the Gullet. She wanted to catch a glimpse of the little Witcher once again. Children had not been trained in Kaer Morhen for near to a quarter of a century. She was not in a great hurry. The narrow killer path meandered and looped its way through the forest, and, in order to master it, the little Witcher would take far longer than she would, following the shortcut. However, she could not loiter either. Beyond the Gullet, the trail turned into the woods and led straight to the fortress. If she did not catch the boy at the precipice, she might not see him at all. She had already visited Kaer Morhen a few times, and knew she saw only what the witches wanted her to see. Triss was not so naive as to be unaware that they wanted to show her only a tiny fraction of the things to be seen in Kaer Morhen. After a few minutes riding along the stony trough of the stream, she caught sight of the Gullet, a leap over the gully created by two huge mossy rocks overgrown with gnarled, stunted trees. She released the reins. The horse snorted and lowered its head towards the water, trickling between pebbles. She did not have to wait long. The Witcher's silhouette appeared on the rock, and the boy jumped, not slowing his pace. The magician heard the soft smack of his landing, and a moment later, a rattle of stones, the dull thud of a fall, and a quiet cry, or rather a squeal. Triss instantly leapt from her saddle, threw the fur off her shoulders, and dashed across the mountainside, pulling herself up using tree branches and roots. Momentum aided her climb until she slipped on the conifer needles and fell to her knees next to a figure huddled on the stones. The youngster, on seeing her, jumped up like a spring, backed away in a flash, and nimbly grabbed the sword slung across his back, then tripped and collapsed between the junipers and pines. The magician did not rise from her knees. She stared at the boy and opened her mouth in surprise, because it was not a boy. From beneath an ash-blonde fringe, poorly and unevenly cut, enormous emerald eyes, the predominant features in a small face with a narrow chin and upturned nose, stared out at her. There was fear in the eyes. "Don't be afraid," Triss said tentatively. The girl opened her eyes even wider. She was hardly out of breath and did not appear to be sweating. It was clear she had already run the killer more than once. "Nothing's happened to you?" The girl did not reply. Instead, she sprang up, hissed with pain, shifted her weight to her left leg, bent over and rubbed her knee. She was dressed in a sort of leather suit, sewn together, or rather stuck together, in a way which would make any tailor who took pride in his craft howl in horror and despair. The only pieces of her equipment which seemed to be relatively new and fitted her were her knee-high boots, her belts and her sword, but more precisely, her little sword. "Don't be afraid," repeated Triss, still not rising from her knees. "I heard your fall and was scared. That's why I rushed here. I slept," murmured the girl. "Have you hurt yourself?" "No. You?" The enchantress laughed, tried to get up, winced and swore at the pain in her ankle. She sat down and carefully straightened her foot, swearing once more. "Come here, little one. Help me get up. I'm not little." "If you say so. In that case, what are you?" "A witcher." "Ha! So come here and help me get up, witcher." The girl did not move from the spot. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, and her hands, in their fingerless woolen gloves, toyed with her sword belt as she glanced suspiciously at Triss. "Have no fear," said the enchantress with a smile. I'm not a bandit or outsider. I'm called Triss Merigold, and I'm going to Kaer Morhen. The witches know me. Don't gape at me. I respect your suspicion, but be reasonable. Would I have got this far if I hadn't known the way? Have you ever met a human on the trail? The girl overcame her hesitation, approached and stretched out her hand. Triss stood with only a little assistance, because she was not concerned with having help. She wanted a closer look at the girl, and to touch her. The green eyes of the little witcher girl betrayed no signs of mutation, and the touch of her little hand did not produce the slight, pleasant tingling sensation so characteristic of witches. Although she ran the killer path with a sword slung across her back, the ashen-haired girl had not been subjected to the trial of grasses or to changes. Of that, Triss was certain. Show me your knee, little one. I'm not little. Sorry, but surely you have a name. I do, Ciri. It's a pleasure. A bit closer, if you please, Ciri. It's nothing. I want to see what nothing looks like. Ah, that's what I thought. Nothing looks remarkably like torn trousers and skin grazed down to raw flesh. Stand still, and don't be scared. I'm not scared. Ow! The magician laughed and rubbed her palm, itching from casting the spell against her hip. The girl bent over and gazed at her knee. Oh, she said. It doesn't hurt anymore, and there's no hole. Was that magic? You've guessed it. Are you a witch? Guessed again, although I prefer to be called an enchantress. To avoid getting it wrong, you can call me by my name. Triss. Just Triss. Come on, Ciri. My horse is waiting at the bottom. We'll go to Kaer Morhen together. I ought to run. Ciri shook her head. It's not good to stop running, because you get milk in your muscles. Geralt says. Geralt is at the keep. Ciri frowned, pinched her lips together, and shot a glance at the enchantress from beneath her ashen fringe. Triss chuckled again. All right, she said. I won't ask. A secret's a secret, and you're right not to disclose it to someone you hardly know. Come on. When we get there, we'll see who's at the castle and who isn't. And don't worry about your muscles. I know what to do about lactic acid. Ah, here's my mount. I'll help you. She stretched out her hand, but Ciri didn't need any help. She jumped agilely into the saddle, lightly, almost without taking off. The gelding started, surprised, and stamped, but the girl quickly took up the reins and reassured it. You know how to handle a horse, I see. I can handle anything. Move up towards the pommel. Triss slipped her foot into the stirrup and caught hold of the mane. Make a bit of room for me, and don't poke my eye out with that sword. The gelding, spurred on by her heels, moved off along the stream bed at a walking pace. They rode across another gully and climbed the rounded mountainside. From there, they could see the ruins of Kaer Morhen, huddled against the stone precipices. The partially demolished trapezium of the defensive wall, the remains of the barbican and gate, the thick, blunt column of the donjon. The gelding snorted and jerked its head, crossing what remained of the bridge over the moat. Triss tugged at the reins. The decaying skulls and skeletons strewn across the riverbed made no impression on her. She had seen them before. I don't like this, the girl suddenly remarked. It's not as it should be. The dead should be buried in the ground, under a barrow, shouldn't they? They should, the magician agreed calmly. I think so too. But the witches treat this graveyard as a reminder. Reminder of what? Kaer Morhen, Triss said, as she guided the horse towards the shattered arcades, was assaulted. There was a bloody battle here in which almost all the witches died. Only those who weren't in the keep at the time survived. Who attacked them? And why? I don't know, she lied. It was a terribly long time ago, Ciri. Ask the witches about it. I have, grunted the girl, but they didn't want to tell me. I can understand that, thought the magician. A child trained to be a witcher, a girl at that, who has not undergone the mutations, should not be told such things. A child like that should not hear about the massacre. A child like that should not be terrified by the prospect that they too may one day hear words describing it like those which were screamed by the fanatics who marched on Kaer Morhen long ago. mutant, monster, freak, damned by the gods, a creature contrary to nature. No, I do not blame the witches for not telling you about it, little Ciri, and I shan't tell you either. I have even more reason to be silent, because I am a wizard, and without the aid of wizards, those fanatics would never have conquered the castle, and that hideous lampoon, that widely distributed monstrum which stirred the fanatics up and drove them to such wickedness was also, apparently, some wizard's anonymous work. But I, little Ciri, do not recognize collective responsibility.